Paris, 1823. On the edge of Montfaucon, a district already burdened by the weight of centuries of executions, a gravedigger made a chilling discovery. Beneath a half-collapsed tombstone in the city's northern cemetery lay not the skeletal remains expected of a 14th century burial, but something far stranger. Hidden in the soil were dozens of small wooden effigies, their faces carved into grotesque expressions of agony, each marked with a date, and each date corresponded not to the year of burial, but to unsolved disappearances that had plagued the city in the centuries that followed. The discovery was dismissed at first, quietly noted in the cemetery's parish register, but the gravedigger, unnerved by what he had seen, whispered about it in taverns. Soon, fragments of a forgotten history began to resurface. Old chronicles of shadowed rituals, sudden vanishings, and an order of men who swore oaths to keep their deeds buried alongside the dead. How many secrets can soil absorb before it becomes more than earth? How many names, unspoken for centuries, still lie waiting beneath the stone markers of forgotten graves? This is not merely a tale of a cemetery. It is the story of what the living once did to the living and what the dead were forced to carry into eternity. And as we unearth these shadows, we must ask ourselves, do some truths stay buried because they are too dangerous to remember? The early 19th century in France was an age of transition. Napoleon was gone, the Bourbon monarchy had returned, and across Europe new ideas of progress clashed with the remnants of medieval superstition. Yet beneath the polished boulevards and the grand cathedrals, the soil of Paris still held its darker histories. Cemeteries were overflowing, bones were shifted from one graveyard to another. The living walked on top of the dead. The first shocking clue that reignited this forgotten story was not merely the effigies, but a manuscript discovered only months later in the archives of Saint Denis Abbey. Bound in leather and nearly illegible from mold, the manuscript described what it called the Night Keepers, a brotherhood that once gathered in secret beneath cemetery vaults. Their task, the manuscript hinted, was not prayer, but something far more chilling, ensuring that certain names never appeared on church records and that certain deaths were never marked by holy rites. Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and what time is it there? The hour may matter more than you think, because as we go back further into the origins of this cemetery and its rituals, the darkness only grows thicker. This was not just a story that vanished from public memory. It was a story deliberately erased. To understand shadows in the cemetery, we must return to the late 1300s, when Europe was staggering from the Black Death. Paris, like so many cities, had been devastated. Tens of thousands of bodies needed burial, and the ground of the city's cemeteries swelled with corpses. Montfaucon became not just a graveyard, but a dumping ground, a place where justice, punishment, and pestilence all mingled in the soil. It was here, according to scattered municipal records, that a strange pattern began. Certain individuals, often accused of heresy, treason, or witchcraft, would vanish before trial. Their families would whisper that the church had taken them in silence. Others swore that they had seen hooded men carrying bodies through the cemetery gates at night. And when bones were uncovered decades later, they were often charred, bound, or defaced as though some ritual had been performed before burial. One of the earliest accounts comes from 1377, when a parish priest named Guillaume de Saint-André noted that 12 villages from the outskirts of Paris had disappeared over a span of 3 months. He wrote, "No trial, no record, no last confession. Only the earth has taken them, but not in the light of day." At the time it was dismissed as plague hysteria. Yet the priest's words aligned with later evidence, suggesting that a hidden system of punishment was at work. The manuscript from Saint-Denis described the night keepers not as priests, but as men drawn from different stations of life, failed clerics, disinherited nobles, and even executioners' sons. Their leader, known only as the custodian, was said to wield authority over who would be remembered and who would be erased. The Brotherhood, bound by oaths, justified their deeds as protecting the city from corruption. But whispers suggested a darker motive, that they offered these nameless dead as sacrifices in exchange for influence, wealth, or forbidden knowledge. The names of these figures are difficult to verify. One appears repeatedly in marginal notes. Etienne Vautrin, a notary who vanished from records in 1392. Another, called simply the Grey Friar, may have been a disgraced monk. Whoever they were, they operated in the shadows, leaving only faint trails in church ledgers and unexplained gaps in public records. Imagine the cemetery at night in the late 14th century, the damp smell of soil, the heavy mist rolling from the Seine, the creak of iron gates. Beneath the chapels, candlelit chambers where bones were stacked high against the walls. In these crypts, voices reciting words not found in scripture, punctuated by the scrape of shovels and the muted thud of earth covering flesh. The effigies unearthed centuries later echo this atmosphere, each doll a silent witness, each carved face a frozen scream. Hidden chambers have been documented. In 1841, during renovations, workers found a bricked-up passage beneath Montfaucon Cemetery, leading to a vaulted room where inscriptions were carved into stone. We hold the silence of the city. No official explanation was ever given. By the dawn of the 15th century, whispers of these secret burials grew. Entire families avoided passing the cemetery after dark. Local law warned that those who lingered near the gates at midnight might vanish themselves. The records of missing persons swelled, but official statements were scarce. One particularly disturbing pattern emerged. Every disappearance coincided with feast days, dates when the church was preoccupied with public ceremonies. This timing ensured fewer eyes on the cemetery and fewer questions asked about missing individuals. The red flags were there, but the terror of plague and political unrest kept most from speaking too loudly. It was easier to believe in sickness than in human cruelty. Archival letters hint at city officials who knew more than they admitted. In 1411, a councilman named Pierre Daumont wrote in a private letter that men in dark cloaks visit the cemetery by torchlight, and we do not speak of it, for to speak is to join them. Daumont's letter ends abruptly, with ink smeared as though the page were torn away mid-sentence. He was never mentioned again in municipal proceedings. Rumors also spread of faint music chanting carried on the wind from beneath the cemetery ground. Whether real or imagined, it convinced many that the soil of Montfaucon was not a place of rest, but of restless deeds. For nearly a century, these shadows persisted, half rumor, half terror. But the cemetery was about to claim a victim whose disappearance would be too significant to erase, too politically dangerous to ignore. A victim whose story would unravel the Brotherhood's secrecy and ignite the long-buried truth. And it all began with a noble family. A daughter promised to marry into power, and the night she never came home. It was the spring of 1447 when Paris prepared for the union of two noble houses. The Montreuil, an old lineage of knights fallen into financial decline, had arranged for their only daughter, Isabelle de Montreuil, to wed the wealthy merchant family with growing influence in the city's political circles. Isabelle was 19, known for her education, her unusual fondness for reading Latin texts, and her bold spirit, rare traits for a woman of her time. On the evening of May 12th, she left her family estate to visit a chapel near Montfaucon Cemetery. The visit was routine. She often prayed there, lit candles for her deceased mother, and spoke with the chaplain. But that night she never returned. Witnesses recalled seeing her carriage approach the cemetery gates shortly before dusk. Some swore they saw a torchlight flicker in the distance, though the chaplain later testified that no services had been scheduled for that hour. By morning, Isabelle's carriage was found abandoned near the outer wall of Montfaucon, the horse still tethered, restless, and covered in cold sweat. Inside, her prayer book remained open, as though dropped mid-reading. The disappearance sent a shockwave through Paris. Isabel was not a commoner whose vanishing could be dismissed as plague or accident. She was nobility. Her father demanded immediate answers, and for the first time in decades, Montfaucon Cemetery became the center of official inquiry. Investigators pieced together the final hours of Isabel's life through fragmented accounts. The carriage arrived just before sunset. A guard claimed he saw her step out, carrying a lantern, but from there the trail blurred. Neighbors reported hearing distant chanting that same night, low voices, rhythmic, carried by the wind. A shepherd boy claimed he saw figures in dark cloaks moving between the gravestones, their lanterns glowing like fireflies in the mist. One described Isabel's cry muffled quickly, as though swallowed by the earth itself. When search parties combed the cemetery, they uncovered fresh soil disturbed near an old vault. Shovels struck wood, but it was not Isabel's coffin they uncovered. It was a small chest filled with carved wooden effigies, each marked with a date and a symbol. The most recent effigy bore the inscription, the 12th of May 1447, the date of Isabel's disappearance. The meaning was undeniable. Whoever had taken her had prepared her effigy before the act, suggesting planning, ritual, and an intention that went beyond mere crime. The Parisian constabulary, under pressure from noble families, launched a full investigation. Montfaucon Cemetery was sealed, its gates guarded day and night. Clerics were summoned to bless the grounds, though whispers said their prayers did little to silence the unease. Records from that time detail exhaustive searches of the crypts and catacombs beneath the cemetery. Hidden chambers were found, lined with human remains, many bound with rope or bearing strange markings carved into bone. Officials called them unfortunate victims of grave robbers, but others began to mutter that the night keepers had returned. The manuscript discovered centuries later confirmed what officials dared not admit in 1447. Isabel had likely been taken by the same clandestine brotherhood that had haunted Paris for generations. The effigy with her date was not merely a token but a signature of their power. Despite mounting evidence, the investigation faltered. Witnesses recanted their statements under pressure. Guards who had sworn to seeing figures in cloaks later claimed they had been mistaken. Rumors spread that bribes had exchanged hands, silencing those who knew too much. The chaplain, who should have been a key witness, insisted he had seen nothing unusual. Yet a later inventory of the chapel revealed torn pages from prayer books, with fragments of Latin phrases not aligned with Catholic rites. Custodimus noctem, we keep the night. The constables scoured Montfaucon for weeks, but Isabel's body was never found. Without her, there could be no trial, no official condemnation. The case slipped into silence, labeled an unresolved disappearance. The Montreuil family, devastated, withdrew from public life. Their daughter's fate became another shadow in the cemetery. Years later, scattered testimonies began to emerge, preserved in diaries and municipal notes. One account came from a young novice monk who claimed he had been summoned to deliver supplies to a hidden chamber beneath the cemetery. He described seeing cloaked men kneeling before an altar made of human bones. On the altar lay a figure shrouded in white, a woman, unmoving. He fled before seeing more. Another testimony came from a gravedigger's apprentice, who decades later confessed that he had once been paid to dig graves not listed in church records. They told me to bury without a marker, without a name. And when I asked who they were, they said, "We are the keepers of silence." Individually, these testimonies could be dismissed as fear, rumor, or fabrication. But taken together, they painted a consistent, chilling picture. Isabel's disappearance was no accident. It was a deliberate act carried out by men who had operated in shadows for centuries. The twist came nearly 50 years later, in 1495, when a fire ravaged part of the Saint-Denis Abbey. In the ashes of its library, monks uncovered a sealed box of parchments long hidden within the walls. Among them was a ledger written in coded script. When decrypted, it revealed a list of names individuals who had vanished without trial. Next to each name was a date and a symbol matching those carved onto the effigies unearthed centuries later. And there, near the end of the list, was the name Isabelle de Montreuil. The ledger confirmed what had long been whispered. Her disappearance was part of a systematic, deliberate pattern. But the most disturbing entry came after her name. A symbol, unlike the others, described in the ledger as the marriage of shadows. What did it mean? Historians speculated was a ritual of binding, a symbolic union between the victim and the brotherhood itself, sealing her fate not as a forgotten woman but as a sacrifice to their secrecy. This revelation transformed Isabelle's case from a singular tragedy into proof of a larger conspiracy that spanned generations. The Nightkeepers had not only erased lives, but had done so with ritual precision, leaving behind artifacts that still defied explanation. By the dawn of the 16th century, Paris whispered of the Nightkeepers in fear. The ledger, the effigies, the testimonies, all pointed to a network of secrecy that had infiltrated cemeteries, churches, and even city officials. And though Isabelle's body was never found, her absence became the rallying cry of those who sought to expose the truth. The climax of the story was approaching, for in 1512, a confrontation would shatter the silence, forcing the Brotherhood into the open for the first time in centuries. In the year 1512, Paris had grown restless. Whispers of disappearances had once again begun to rise, echoing the stories of the 14th and 15th centuries. Merchants' sons, a novice scholar from the Sorbonne, even a messenger in service of the crown, all vanished without trace. The discovery of the ledger in Saint-Denis decades earlier had been buried by the church, but copies had circulated in secret. Among the educated elite, a quiet outrage simmered. The decisive blow came when a young cleric, Etienne Lemaitre, broke ranks and accused senior officials of protecting the Nightkeepers. His voice carried weight. He had access to archives and had studied the coded ledger extensively. Lemaitre insisted that the Brotherhood still met beneath Montfaucon, that Isabelle de Montreuil had not been their last victim, and that the effigies carved with names and dates were part of a ritual contract binding the dead to their silence. The authorities could no longer ignore the accusations. King Louis XII, under mounting pressure from noble families and the Parliament of Paris, ordered a full inquest. For the first time, Montfaucon Cemetery was not just investigated but raided. The night of the raid would become infamous. Guards descended into bricked-up passages newly unearthed beneath the cemetery chapel. Torches flickered against damp stone walls as soldiers pried open iron doors long rusted shut. What they found confirmed centuries of rumor. A hidden sanctuary, its vaulted ceilings blackened with smoke, its altar draped with tattered cloth. Bones arranged in geometric patterns lined the floor. Effigies were stacked neatly against one wall, dozens of them, their faces carved in anguish. And then the Brotherhood themselves were found, not shadows, not phantoms, but men, cloaked, kneeling in a circle, reciting words in a language that sounded like a corruption of Latin. When the soldiers burst in, the cloaked figures did not run. They turned slowly, their faces pale, some muttering prayers, others smiling, as though they had expected this moment all along. The confrontation turned violent. Steel clashed in the flickering torchlight, cries of pain echoing off stone. The Brotherhood resisted with desperate fury, but many were subdued. Several were captured alive. Among them was one man identified by witnesses as the custodian, the Brotherhood's elusive leader. Under interrogation, fragments of the truth began to emerge. The Brotherhood did not see themselves as murderers, but as guardians. They claimed their mission had been passed down since the Black Death, to remove those they deemed dangerous to the stability of Paris: heretics, political agitators, even those who threatened to disrupt alliances between powerful families. The effigies, they said, were a way of ensuring that the victim's soul remained bound, preventing unrest among the living. Each effigy was carved before the act as part of a ritual of intention. In their eyes, they were not criminals, but stewards of a hidden order, sacrificing individuals for what they believed was the greater good. Yet as their testimonies unfolded, a darker truth seeped through. Documents recovered from their hidden sanctuary revealed that noble patrons had occasionally employed the night keepers for their own purposes. Political rivals disappeared conveniently. Merchants who resisted certain deals were silenced. The Brotherhood, once cloaked in mysticism, had become an instrument of power and greed. The planning was meticulous. Victims were chosen months in advance. Effigies were carved and hidden in vaults, the dates carefully inscribed. The disappearances were timed to coincide with feast days or public spectacles, ensuring the city's attention was elsewhere. Most chilling was the revelation about Isabelle de Montreuil. According to recovered notes, her disappearance had been ordered by powerful allies of the very merchant family she was meant to marry into. Her independence, her refusal to be silent in matters of politics and theology, had marked her as dangerous. The night keepers had been called upon to erase her voice. The trial of the night keepers in 1513 was unlike anything Paris had seen before. Pamphlets circulated through the city, recounting tales of effigies, secret rituals, and hidden chambers beneath the cemetery. The people, who had long whispered of shadows in Montfaucon, finally saw their fears confirmed. Crowds gathered outside the courts, demanding justice, their voices echoing in anger against the secrecy of the elite. Chroniclers of the time described panic spreading through Paris. Families feared that their missing loved ones had been taken by the Brotherhood. Some flocked to Montfaucon to dig near graves, hoping to find signs of effigies or hidden chambers. Others called for the cemetery itself to be destroyed, believing the ground to be cursed beyond redemption. The media of the day, the scribes, the pamphleteers, the preachers told conflicting stories. Some emphasized the horror of the rituals, claiming the night keepers worshipped demons. Others argued it was a conspiracy fabricated by political rivals to tarnish noble families. Truth and rumor intertwined until the line between them blurred. For the Montreuil family, the revelations reopened old wounds. Isabelle's father had long since passed, but her younger brother Henri spoke publicly at the trial. His voice, trembling with both grief and fury, demanded recognition of his sister's fate. She was no heretic, no traitor. She was a daughter, a sister, a woman of faith, and you buried her in silence. His words resonated across the courtroom, drawing tears even from hardened officials. The Montreuil's tragedy became a symbol of the many nameless victims. Families who had lost loved ones without explanation began to see themselves reflected in Isabelle's story. For them, the trial was not only about punishment but about recognition, about forcing history to acknowledge what had been erased. The exposure of the night keepers sent ripples far beyond the cemetery walls. Trust in the church and city officials faltered as questions arose: how many had known? How many had benefited? Some clerics resigned in disgrace. Several noble families quietly distanced themselves from the scandal, destroying records that might link them to the Brotherhood. But the impact lingered in more insidious ways. Cemeteries across France came under suspicion. Rumors of hidden brotherhoods spread from town to town. In Lyon, in Rouen, even in small villages, locals whispered of keepers of silence. Whether these fears were justified or not, they reflected a new paranoia that the dead were not safe in their graves and that the living might vanish into the soil without a trace. Parisian society also shifted. The effigies, once symbols of secret control, became objects of fear. Children were warned that dolls left in graveyards could curse them. Toy makers avoided carving faces that resembled screams. The trauma of the revelations seeped into culture, altering traditions and superstitions for generations. The trial ended with executions. The Brotherhood's leaders put to death in public squares, yet their secrets did not all perish with them. Documents vanished from archives. Effigies were quietly collected and stored, only to resurface centuries later. The silence continued even after the confrontation. For though Montfaucon Cemetery eventually fell into ruin, its soil remained thick with shadows, and history, as it so often does, chose to forget more than it remembered. But the question remained, why was this history so carefully erased? Who chose to bury the truth once more? The answers would only come centuries later, when a new generation of historians began piecing the fragments back together. Centuries passed. Montfaucon Cemetery, once the site of countless executions and whispered rituals, eventually fell into disrepair. By the late 1700s, Paris faced new crises: revolution, guillotines, and the construction of the catacombs that would swallow millions of bones. Montfaucon was abandoned, its soil deemed unholy, its tombstones broken and carried off as building material. The memory of the Night Keepers dissolved into folklore, dismissed as paranoia from a superstitious age. But silence never lasts forever. In 1823, the gravediggers' discovery of the effigies reignited questions, and later, the manuscript from Saint-Denis brought Isabelle de Montreuil's name back into the light. By the late 19th century, French historians began revisiting forgotten municipal ledgers, piecing together a narrative that had been deliberately obscured. In 1894, a young historian named Louise Caron uncovered references to the Marriage of Shadows ritual in documents stored at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Her work, published quietly in academic circles, suggested that the Night Keepers were not an isolated sect but part of a broader system of control. Nobles, merchants, even church officials had leaned on them to erase inconvenient lives. And then, in the 20th century, archaeologists surveying the ruins of Montfaucon found another hidden chamber smaller than the first, but unmistakable. Inside lay fragments of effigies broken and burned, alongside a wall inscription, Custodimus Noctem, we keep the night. It was undeniable. The Brotherhood had existed. Their rituals had shaped Parisian history, their silence enforced through blood and fear. Isabelle de Montreuil was not simply a victim of disappearance, she was one of countless souls buried in shadows. Today, the ruins of Montfaucon no longer stand. The ground has been paved, built over, transformed. But the story of the Night Keepers, pieced together from fragments of effigies, diaries, and testimonies, refuses to stay buried. Why do some truths remain hidden for centuries? Why does history choose silence when faced with horror? Perhaps because acknowledging such darkness forces us to confront the fragility of memory, the ease with which power can erase lives. The story of the Night Keepers is not only about forgotten rituals in a cemetery, it is about how easily fear, secrecy, and authority can conspire to bury the past. Isabelle's effigy, her name inscribed in a hidden ledger, reminds us that every forgotten grave may conceal more than bones. As we walk through modern cemeteries, clean and orderly, do we ever wonder what shadows lie beneath? How many names were erased? How many lives unrecorded? And if such a brotherhood operated for centuries in plain sight, protected by those in power, how many more stories remain sealed beneath stone? So I ask you, do you believe the Night Keepers were truly extinguished in the 16th century? Or do you think their silence may have survived, hidden in other forms, passed through whispers and secret oaths? Could similar brotherhoods have existed elsewhere, rewriting history in the shadows of their cemeteries? Share your thoughts below. I want to hear your perspective. If you've journeyed this far into the depths of forgotten history, stay with us as we continue uncovering the secrets that time tried to erase. Subscribe to the channel, share this story with others who are drawn to the darkness of the past, and remember, every forgotten shadow has its witness.